welcome to the Lutheran History Podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Mark Braun of Wisconsin Lutheran College. Dr. Braun, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and some of the work that you've done within Lutheran history?
Okay, well, I was a 1978 seminary graduate. I was a pastor at first a church in Western Michigan and then Western Wisconsin. I've been teaching at Wisconsin Lutheran College for now 34 years. And I always teach a course in American Christianity or American religion. And so that was my interest area. And then I did a dissertation on the breakup or the split of the Missouri and Wisconsin synods in what was known as a synodical conference. And that was really a piece of work that was allowed me to get way beyond what was published and what was official, to get back into people's personal papers, letters they wrote. I was able to interview about 80 or 90 pastors, probably all of whom have gone to heaven now. And so that's, I'm pretty much done after this year. Time to retire, I guess.
Yeah, what a long career in ministry there.
Yeah,
Sure.
Longer than I expected.
Well, today we're recording what will be the first official episode for the Lutheran History Podcast. I hope there will be many more after this. But obviously, this podcast is about the history of Lutheranism. But I'd suspect that there will be some people who discover this podcast who don't really know what a Lutheran is. So I know this is above your pay grade a bit to explain this, but would you do us the honor of inaugurating the show by explaining what a Lutheran is?
Well, it's a big subject, but let me just say this. In the 15th century, 1500s, there were a series of protests against the major Christian church, the Catholic Church. And those protests led to Protestant churches in various parts of Europe. And the churches tended to follow their reformer in different locations. So the followers that hooked on to Luther's interpretation of scripture and salvation tended to be in Germany and in the Scandinavian countries, and that's still true today. But then there were massive migrations from Germany especially, but also from Scandinavian countries to the United States, and also to some in Australia. And so I would think one thing I would also say about Lutheranism in America is that since all of those immigrants did not speak English, and it took them a couple generations to become Americanized, they tended to remain a bit separate from the larger Christian and Protestant picture. And in some ways, that's the history of the 20th century with Lutherans has been a matter of how quickly and how much they adapt to American life and modern life, if you will.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. And I think the subject of our discussion today, Little Journeys with Martin Luther, really picks up on that, one of those transitional phases between the different ethnic groups of Lutherans, and now they're all kind of speaking English or about to adopt English.
Yes.
And a real turning point, I think, in Lutheran history in America. So what is this book called, Little Journeys with Martin Luther, and what made you think it was worth dusting off after a century and presenting on it once again?
Well, I see farther down in your questions, you have a question about my method. That would I'll wait till then to talk about how specifically I came to this book. But it is true that the author of this book, William Nicholas Harley, was one of a few pastors in all the synods at that time who was adept at English. And while he was in the Lutheran Church in Ohio, the Ohio Synod, which was still largely using German, some pastors were successful in being able to write and speak in English without, honestly, they worried about embarrassing themselves. And he wrote this book in 1916, which was a significant time for Lutherans for a couple of reasons. The First World War was sort of forcing Lutherans to get to know each other from these other synods. I see numbers something like 60 different synods, or maybe over 100 little Lutheran bodies all over the United States. They were separated by certainly distance and language, but also by their teachings and their loyalty or their opposition to certain leaders. But the war forced a lot of young men to get to talk with each other, and they wondered, why aren't we together more? Secondly, in 1917 was going to be the 400th anniversary of the Lutheran Reformation, And so there were a lot of people saying we should talk with each other and have a joint kind of celebration. And so Harley's book really, you can tell his viewpoint on this, because he talks in the beginning about what a shame it is that we are all separated from each other, and couldn't we all get together? But as you go along in the book, you also see that he, like a lot of other Lutheran leaders, wanted us to get together, but kind of on his terms and following his view of what we should be like.
Yeah, and that's kind of the common denominator, I guess. There are all these different Lutheran groups, and of course, they all want to be united, but they all think everyone should be just like them, and that's the basis for unity. Of course, there are much deeper foundations for unity than that.
Yeah, and I think church members, and to a certain extent pastors, serving those church members, they may have a slightly lower common denominator than the church officials or the professors have. In fact, there was one similar meeting at this time where the pastor said, we don't want the professors to even come to the meeting because they all insist that their way must be followed. And I don't know that their effort turned out any better than anybody else's. But so Harley writes this fictional story, obviously, of where the statue of Martin Luther, which was in front of a Lutheran church in Washington, D.C., comes down off the pedestal, becomes alive, and goes traveling to the centers of various Lutheran groups, or synods, as we call them, trying to figure out if he would fit in and whether they would accept him and he could accept them. The story could be, what would Luther join? What church would he come to? And so, in a way, the story is a critique of an analysis of the different Lutheran synods at the time. By the time Harley wrote, a lot of these smaller synods were finding each other and making plans, at least informally, and they would become formal to become joined together. And a unique feature of the book is that Harley took everything that is put into the mouth of this fictional Luther, comes from Luther's own writings, which he translated from a German version. There was not a very widespread or useful translation of all of Luther's works into English at that time. So as you read along, if you know something of Luther, you can recognize a lot of the quotations that are there. Although Luther, the real Luther, didn't exactly always say those quotations to that context. And as I think I mentioned, and we talked previously, it reminds me a little bit of when some political ads pull little short clips from the opponent's speech and then put them in the middle of a dialogue to make him say something he wasn't quite saying. So one of the challenges is a little bit hard to find your way back into where Luther said this and what it was in English. But it's interesting, and it was certainly a large amount of work for Harley to do.
Yeah, it seems as if this book is somewhere between a scholarly work where he's translating Luther from the German into English, and it's somewhere between that and being an opinion piece where he's trying to pull Luther onto his side and make Luther speak what he wants him to speak too. So
That's
but
certainly true.
yeah, but from our perspective, a century later, at least, it's just useful to see what was a contemporary perspective of Lutheranism in America at that time. So that's another valuable thing this book offers. So, could you tell us a bit more about the author, William Nicholas Harley? Do we know much about him?
A little bit here. Let's see. I just have to remember which place I put this here. Born in 1864 in Pennsylvania, was going to be a printer, and then ended up going to the Lutheran University in Columbus, Ohio, and graduated from the seminary in 1891. He spent some time working with African Americans around Baltimore, and spent the last 23 years of his life at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church in Columbus. And in his obituary, he is remembered as a forceful speaker and a man of more than ordinary literary attainments, his command of the English language having been almost perfect. And I would say that when you read other things that men have written whose primary language was German, he's very adept and easy to read, a little bit kind of cute in some places. The obituary's author said, that the book Little Journeys was the result of more than 20 years of painstaking reading and research and was a masterpiece both in its exact quotations of the works of Luther and in their rendition into the English language. So there are major chapters in which he goes to visit some of the leaders of the church bodies in their hometown, like in St. Louis or in Chicago or wherever. But then there are almost more lighthearted chapters where he's riding with his driver of the coach, and he's making comments on lots of other aspects of American life, both religious and otherwise. And again, it's hard work and it's clever what he did.
Yeah, and I do like his approach. It's to have Luther kind of reincarnated through a statue visit these various Lutheran synods, trying
Yeah.
to see which one's the best fit for Luther. Well, almost every synod bears Luther's name, so they all must think that, well, we are Luther-like or Luther-esque. But for some listeners who may not even know, what is a synod, and what were some of the major synods of 1916 when this book was published?
Yeah, I don't know. The Catholic Church uses the term synod, but I think they mean that more as a meeting.
Mhm.
But the idea of the word means that people come together, that they're walking together in the same direction. And so there were, I think, throughout the history of Lutheranism in this country, there were kind of individualistic, independent preachers who kind of traveled from place to place. Sometimes I'm sure Pastor Biebert could tell you some stories, maybe he has, about some that were a little bit not just entrepreneurial, but maybe a little bit dishonest and cagey figures. But as the churches get settled, they want to work together so that they can publish together and perhaps start schools of some kind and do more organized mission work. And so there were several major synods by the mid-19 teens where smaller bodies either had joined together or were thinking about it, and they were somewhat regional sometimes, but then there were plenty of independent Lutheran bodies as well, sometimes just down to a single congregation someplace. So he goes to the major groups, and it's very easy to follow his journeys and the conversations he has with people.
Yeah, and kind of off the top of your head, what were some of those major groups, those major synods,
Well,
essentially?
the first one that he went to was the General Synod. And the General Synod had actually been formed a century before, but it was a very loose organization of people who said they were Lutheran, but it was not, from our point of view, really demanding of a high degree of agreement. Now, the General Synod, pretty much in that shape, became the United Lutheran Church of America in 1918, which existed until it went to another merger in the 1980s. And so he went there, and first of all, and so he records some of the conversations they would have had, but there were some things that they disagreed about, and so the General Synod was more willing to invite preachers or have communion with people who were not Lutheran, and Luther was very unhappy about that, and so the General Synod said, well, he certainly was a man of fine talents, but he must go to some other synod. And he mentions that maybe he should go to the General Council or to the Missouri Synod. The book all the way through it makes fun of the Missouri Synod in some ways, and yet there's also a sense of admiration that they are as successful and they grow the way they do, and yet they have such strong beliefs. So from there, he went to the United Synod of the South, which was a break-off somewhat because of the Civil War, and about at that time, they again talked about some of these same subjects, but the view of communion was, their disagreement was to say, should we believe that in the sacrament you are receiving Christ's true body and blood in a sacramental, mysterious way, or is this simply a reminder or a symbol, which was more the way many other Protestants have taught and still thought. And they concluded that Luther was a stubborn, hidebound prophet and an obstinate old man who'll never do in our synod. From there, he went to the General Council. Now, the General Council is another group that had broken away from the General Synod. This is really an alphabet soup, and especially if you ever take this course at a college or seminary level, I mean, it gets bewildering. But so you would have expected that the Luther figure would have found more to like in the General Council. but there were some things that, again, they disagreed about. Um, um, they said to him at the end, no matter whether a man holds the one view or the other on subjects like communion and about whether there's going to be a millennium on earth, we think of you as a good man. And Brother Martin, you may lose no sleep over these differences. To which Luther says, is that nothing to you? If they affirm, I affirm. If they deny, I deny. From there, he went to the Iowa Synod, which was more obviously in the Midwest geographically, probably more German. And there they disagreed over what they called open questions. In other words, are there some teachings in the Bible that, or let's say they're not decided in the Bible? And he had a firmer view than the Iowa Synod did about what were really open questions or not. Now, there's history to that, which confirms that was a difference between the Iowa Synod and to some extent the Ohio Synod, where Harley came from, and churches in what was called the Synodical Conference. And so the book seems to move toward the point, kind of climactically, of when Luther is going to make his visit in St. Louis, and that's the center of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And as I say, the feeling of other Lutherans were that they were very insistent on their doctrinal teaching, successful in doing mission work, and yet very demanding of their viewpoint. And so the part of the book that keeps being quoted all the time when people write about this is this. He says, one of the first days of winter, I arrived at St. Louis, but the sun was without warmth. The Missouri pastors whom I met were all courteous, but somehow the impression was left that it was meant to be the kindness of superior creatures to an inferior strain of the same breed. The Missouri pastor who went with Luther was a large, austere-looking German who carried a gold-headed cane, wore a silk hat, and strode along with an air that said, ich bin, I am, I am. He was so over-anxious to walk erect that he leaned over backward because they are so concerned about being strictly orthodox. And then he says, but for all of that, I like him, and it makes us smile. And so they have a meeting, and they found that they agree on many subjects, and they like Luther by and large. And so it looks like he's going to join the Missouri Synod. And then they have a disagreement over the somewhat complicated teaching of election. Mm-hmm. And the history here is that the Ohio Synod, where Harley came from, and the Missouri Synod and their other groups with them had a bitter disagreement over this teaching. And what I find intriguing is that somehow Harley, in all of Luther's writings, found a passage in which the real Martin Luther spoke more like an Ohio Synod person than a Missouri Synod person. And it was sort of a gotcha moment when Luther said this and kind of implicated himself, and the rest of the Missourian says, he's a heretic, he can't join us. And so Luther says they are proud and haughty spirits. This Missouri Synod Church says that he is a heretic, and he's going to go to the Ohio Synod. And we're thinking, all right, the Ohio Synod is going to be the winner because this is where Harley came from. Mm-hmm. And he's staying in his hotel room the night before the meeting, and he wakes up and finds out that the whole story was a dream. I think the old television show Dallas had an entire year that was somebody's dream, and one other TV sitcom, the entire sitcom was finished off as a dream sequence. So we never really find out what he would have said about the Ohio Synod. And then that leads to his punchline at the end of the book about what he thinks ought to happen to the synods, that they would learn to get along with each other.
Yeah, that's an interesting storytelling technique that, as you mentioned, we see time and again. I wonder if he was trying to save himself from appearing as self-righteous, to have Luther just applaud the Ohio Synod or something. You kind of wonder.
I don't know. I don't know if he was facing criticism somewhere to make it a little bit less direct. I don't know. Yeah, but it is an interesting way to tell this story.
Yeah, and kind of going off script here as you were retelling or summarizing the book, and you're talking about how the Missouri Synod was portrayed through this figure who was, rather German and austere. I wonder if in 1916, just the popular American image of a German and the Missouri Synod were purposely tied together. Do you think that maybe meant something even more back then than it would today?
Well, I think so too. And the early the war years in the 19 teens were also a difficult time for German Lutherans because it suddenly, and I would say suddenly, became unpopular and even dangerous to have German affiliations. You asked, and when we get to this question about how someone like Porterfield Krauth felt about Luther as a figure and whether he endures. And I think one of the things that surprises me is some of the secular leaders in the beginning of the 20th century that have very high regard for the Lutheran Church. Teddy Roosevelt, for example, talked about the Lutheran Church is going to have a great history. Well, that was in 1905. By 1915, 1916, Roosevelt was raging against so-called hyphenated Americans and people that were holding on too much of their ethnic view. And by then, the Germans were certainly regarded as suspect, even dangerous. And for their part, the German Americans held on a long time to their loyalties to Germany. That was a hard time. And of course, I think Americans have come to be much more suspect of Germans during the 20th century. So that hasn't really helped Lutheranism in America either too much as far as the feeling they have about us. In fact, I think when you read some of those optimistic statements about how Americans would look at Lutherans in 1916 and see what's happening to the Lutheran Church in the early 21st century in terms of numbers and influence and attitude, didn't turn out the way they thought.
Yeah, and we would say unfortunately, right? But
well, I would say unfortunately, yeah. Some of it might be our fault a little bit, but still.
Sure. Yeah, well, I'm sure that we have plenty to discuss in future episodes from different perspectives. I know there's a good paper on just the United States dealing with German Lutheran synods during World War I. I would like to talk about that sometime. And you also mentioned the election controversy with the Ohio Synod. We'll talk with Dr. John Brenner, hopefully, about his book in the future, and that should really uncover more of that. But back to this book here, do you think that Harley had correct perspectives on these synods as he was filtering them through Luther's experience?
Well, I would say that the big question that has always confronted Lutheran groups when they discover each other and attempt to find a common ground is their answer to the question, to what degree must we agree with each other in order to work together? Can I have your pastor come to my church and preach? Can we take communion at the same altar? And there has always been a difference between the Lutherans and exactly how they answer that question. And in that sense, I think Harley is portraying Lutheran thinking of his own time, but he was also somewhat prophetic in what was going to happen during the 20th century. And in some ways, you take the end of his book and just change the names a little bit, and you have the same situation that exists today. I mean, the Missouri Synod and the groups that were aligned with it, like our Wisconsin Synod and the Evangelical Lutheran Synod, take what some would regard as an extreme view about the degree of agreement that churches should have to work together in church activities. We're not judging the other people's hearts and saying they're not Lutheran, they're not Christian. But today, I would say that the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America is the spiritual descendant of the viewpoint that Harley had, and that especially the General Synod had. And their attitude is to say, we will work with other church bodies first. If we can come to some kind of an agreement, then we'll try to resolve the differences later. And I talk about that with my students, and I sometimes say, that's the theological version of saying, why pay for the cow when the milk is free? Groups that are going to act as though they're in fellowship are going to be inclined not to try to resolve those differences, but let them stand as they are. And so that has always been the issue. The Missouri Synod went through a period in the mid-1950s and 60s where they were wrestling with themselves about what division or direction they were going to take. And their turmoils led to sort of a realigning of the Lutheran church bodies in the United States, which was painful, but in some ways, everybody ended up more in the place where they sort of ideologically belonged, I think, than if they just left it alone.
Yeah, definitely has impact up to this day, all these different perspectives.
Absolutely, yes.
So,
yes.
and as you pointed out, anyone, well, or I would say most people, most modern Lutherans in a Lutheran church body could find their church body's ancestors, or at least their close relatives, in this book, and it might be helpful for them to, if you're curious the history of your church body, to look at this book and maybe see the different perspectives back then, and
Yeah.
maybe do a comparison exercise. How is it similar to where we are today, or how is it different?
Well, it's interesting to see how the Missouri Synod reacts to this book because when you grow up inside of Missouri or in Wisconsin, you have a high regard for the Missouri Synod and imagine that they must have been so well liked and respected. But you can read plenty of writing by other Lutheran leaders that dislike people like CFW Walther and Franz Pieper, who were their speakers, and found the Missouri Synod to be kind of insufferable. And the Missouri Synod itself went through a period where some of its leaders questioned whether they were arrogant, and the word they used was triumphalist. We think that we are right. And now some of the people who have referred to this book say it's still good that we're concerned about our teaching, but we don't want to repeat that attitude that we see in this book. Now, I could mention at this point that my first acquaintance with this book was because in my dissertation research, I had been doing a survey with these old pastors. And the one question I asked them is, as you were a young pastor, did you notice anything about your Missouri Synod pastor neighbors or people that was kind of triumphalist, as they say? And one man is one individual, he wrote and says, there was this book going around school in college. He said, and the Missouri Synod was marching down the street and they said, we're right, we're right, we're right. And he said, the Wisconsin Synod was never mentioned. Well, he was correct about that, but I don't think he read the book, because if you read the book, it's not that complimentary of the Missouri Synod. But I think this man, and there were other of my survey responses that had similar comments, that Missouri was successful. They were kind of proud of it. They were going through a part of their history where they were seeking publicity and wanted to build their reputation, which they had not been before that in the same way. And so that's how I became interested in the book. And I found out that the book didn't quite say what this veteran pastor had remembered about it. But some of the people who have looked at the attitude that's mentioned in the book turn it back on ourselves and say, well, is there something for us to learn from this as far as how we carry ourselves as we bring our message to other people?
Yeah, it's certainly interesting to see how this book has had a lasting impact for quite some time.
Well, and I was surprised to hear a couple of the people that were at the video conference, how they said that it was used in their classroom, and one professor made people read it every year and really saw this as an outstanding snapshot of how things were at that point. It's fictional and it's kind of funny in some ways, but it was more serious maybe to him than people might think.
Yeah, definitely a recommended reading. Well, that being said, are there any weaknesses or deficiencies in the book Little Journeys with Luther?
Well, as I said, if you know Luther, and I don't know him really well, I've never taught a Luther class in college, but you certainly recognize some rather famous passages, and you do think, well, he didn't really say that about that, and would he have said that today? So you wonder if it's a little bit carpentered together. I would just take it as an interesting and fairly accurate picture of one position on Lutheranism early in the 20th century. And then the advice that he gives at the end, he says we should all talk to each other. The pastors of all the synods should talk to each other and listen to each other, but no one should say that anyone else is wrong. And so what I did at the end of my presentation is found a few instances in history since then and looked to see whether Harley's advice really had turned out the way he had predicted. And in some ways, yes, in some ways, no, I would say.
So, for people interested in this book, it's totally accessible on Google Books
Mm-hmm.
online. One thing that, as I looked at it, that struck me right away was its obvious intent to mimic a much older style of
Yes,
books.
yes.
In the front, and for anyone who's watching this visually, There's a facsimile of a Luther woodcut, not a very flattering one, I might add, but there he is, Martin Luther,
Great. Yeah,
from the 1500s, and there you have your
yeah,
physical copy.
he's in his jolly
Yeah,
time of life by then.
a nice wart right in the middle of his forehead too. um, and also, there's just like scrolls and flourishes that you don't really see in books after the 1700s, at least. Um, why do you think this book is put in this style? What do you think it's trying to communicate?
I think it helps with the premise of the book that Luther came down alive and visited the churches. And while he's in modern America, and he sometimes expresses some astonishment at things he sees that are far more modern than he would have ever experienced, he comes back as a medieval man. And I think about your first question, what can you say about Lutherans? I think there's the perception that Lutherans sort of slavishly follow everything Luther ever said. And I occasionally show students some kind of unlikely things that Luther has said, which shows that he was not a modern man. He didn't know modern science. He had some opinions which were entirely his own. And, all of his writing and the notes about Luther probably fill 100 volumes in German. We're up to about 75 or 80 in English, aren't we now? And yet we really only subscribe to 3 documents that he wrote. He had an enormous insight into the gospel and into history. I've read some biographies which are critical of Luther, and yet even they say he was an extraordinary linguist. His German translation of the Bible essentially helped to shape modern German. He had a huge grasp of the Bible. But there are also those who would say that some of his lesser moments in writing had some very bad influences later on in history. And, if you go to a college and have a professor says that, you've got to work your way through that. So I think the book was put together as though a 16th century man is coming to visit in the 20th century. And he would find some things quite unusual, and he would still be a child of his times.
Yeah, I think the style of the book communicated that quite well, that there's something from the past coming here in the
Yes,
present.
yes.
So right underneath Luther's portrait is a quote by, it just says Croth. I assume it's the Charles Porterfield Croth, so the younger one. And he says, 4 potentates ruled the mind of Europe in the Reformation: the Emperor, Erasmus, the Pope, and Luther. The Pope wanes, Erasmus is little, the Emperor is nothing, but Luther abides as a power for all time. His image casts itself upon the current ages as the mountain mirrors itself in the river that winds at its foot, the mighty fixing itself immutably upon the changing. So do you think that Croth was right when he said that, or when Harley quoted that in his book? Is that quote possibly true still today?
I hate to say it, but I think it was somewhat wishful thinking, and I think the 20th century has been hard on Luther in that way. I mean, I got into this a little bit earlier on, where because of the world wars and because of Hitler and some of the things that Luther wrote, which are anti-Semitic in terms of many people's view of them, and scholars who say this led directly to Hitler. That has damaged his reputation quite a bit among American readers. That might be one of the first things they find out about him. I have students today, in fact, I had one a couple of months ago, who the assignment was to react to a comment Luther made about something in Genesis, and he wrote a nice article about Martin Luther King. I'm not sure he knew that there was just a Martin Luther. So there's more of that. The Lutheran Church has not fared as well, I wouldn't say, as Croth expected, at least in terms of numerical growth or influence. But I think it's also interesting to notice how Luther is used by others in other contexts. I'm old enough to remember Luther 500th anniversary of Luther's birthday in 1983, and East Germany turned him into a communist hero because they would quote things that looked like he was supporting sharing your wealth, and that he was a revolutionary against the establishment. You can go to a Unitarian church there and today and sing A Mighty Fortress, and they love Luther because he was a free spirit and an independent thinker. And I'm always struck by how some branches of the Protestant Christian church that don't have a deep sense of history discover Luther and discover John Calvin, and it's though nobody had ever known about him till
Hmm.
then. So I don't know that that really has turned out that way. I'm fond of some writers like Robert Bennett and Mark Noll, current writers who say that Luther has a lot to offer us, both as Christians and as citizens in America, if we'll listen to him. But probably also, um, America is by and large Protestant rather than Lutheran. Um, I could paraphrase a line about Catholics and Protestants in the United States where even the Lutherans wake up and find that they're Protestants, or Arminians where it's important that you make a decision for Jesus, and all the religion on TV that we see is either come down and make your decision for Jesus or you're having an emotional experience of
Hmm.
some kind. And so Luther and the way he spoke and presented his teachings was objective and stalwart and not necessarily, should I say, it's a very masculine kind of presentation. Um, so I'd like it to be true, but what Krauss said, but I'm not so sure that it turned out that way.
Yeah, very interesting to chew upon and wonder though, what is
Yeah.
Luther's role today or in the future? But he certainly does have name recognition, and people are interested in him as he was in the past. But yeah, I had a similar situation. I was applying for a job when I was in college. I went to Martin Luther College, and the interviewer asked me what happened to the king. Don't you go to Martin Luther King College?
Yeah.
No, the original one, Martin Luther. So yeah, there's definitely
Well,
not a across the board, not a
yeah. And I found out
instant recognition.
whenever I was called for jury duty and I said I was a Lutheran pastor, I was almost whisked out the door because I think they would have thought I'd have been hard on defendants and a law and order person and medieval in my approach. And well, I came to do my civic duty, but if they don't want me, what can I do?
Yeah, interesting. All right, well, we'll move on to the next segment, a little bit shorter here. Now, tell us how you went about researching on this project, and did you have any challenges as you did that
Well, as I
research?
say, I first heard about this book from this veteran pastor. And so it took me a while at that time to locate it. I think Google Books wasn't around yet. So I was able to get a copy, I think, from one of the Concordia libraries in Chicago and got acquainted with it. But then when I thought I really should read this beginning to end and see what he's saying. So it was not a very creative process. I went through it and ended up with about 6 pages of notes. Harley organized his book in a very readable way, and so I could just follow his organization and then basically presented the story. And I talked about it in a couple of articles very briefly, and then I presented essentially what I presented to our historical conference, to our own synod historical conference, a small but interested group last fall. And of course, it really doesn't have anything to do with our synod at all, in a way, but it's a look at it from a distance. And other than that, I guess I would, if I could find a way to do it, scout down some of the Luther quotes that surprised me. But since he used a German edition called the Walk edition, it was his own translation,
Hmm.
I'm not quite sure how I'm going to find some of them.
Yeah, you're not going to find a good word search match
No,
to
I
it
go
compared
by,
to an English one. Yeah,
right, and I think I'd go by topic and say, well, if I can find the topic in English, then maybe I can go to the German one and see if that's what the article is. I guess I would start with the bondage of the will, since it's talking about whether you can decide for God or not. But that's a pretty big book too, to find your way through and then to match
yeah,
up.
yeah. The fact checking, because as you mentioned, one of the weaknesses of the book, it seems as if Harley kind of rips some Luther quotes out of context. And if you
Yeah.
would want to investigate the context, how do you find that quote? As you said, the dozens and dozens of volumes of Luther's works makes that nearly impossible to do unless you just have a photographic memory almost of.
Well, and then
Right.
on other issues, there's an early Luther and a late Luther in terms of the maturity that he had as far as his understanding of things, and he most of the things that, like his sermons, they were written down by other people, and some of the things were notes, and he had grad students living in his house and eagerly writing down everything he said at dinner. So sometimes when you read Luther, you don't know exactly what form you're reading. Obviously, the things that he wrote for publication were maybe the most clearly his thoughts and words. So it's hard to say. And frankly, I have other interests that compel me more than trying to find my way through Walk's edition of Luther's works in German.
Yeah, maybe it's best to let this lie where it is. Um, but as you did your research, or maybe just as you read through the book, did anything surprise or excite you?
I don't think so. I had a section of my notes here where I had talked about some of the things he had said along the way about non-Lutheran issues. And again, I think if you're a student of American church history, these takes are interesting. For one place, he says, a new sect has come in from the Yankees and says that there is no disease and that it's all imagination. These different meeting houses quacks act so holy, like they say it to be a sin to take or give medicine. That sounds to me like Christian Science, I'm guessing. It's coming along at that time. And then there are the Dunkers, put their kind under water to make baptism like the burying of Christ. They'd keep them under 3 days. There wouldn't be any of them left to pester Lutheran. I mean, that kind of a statement sounds like the Luther that we read in other places where he was a little salty and sometimes even had a few Trump-like qualities in terms of his language. But the whole era was that way. And then his remedy at the end, where he said, I saved it at the very end. So at the very end of the book, the tone changes from a story about Luther to the author himself talking to us. And he says, as every Lutheran well knows, there is but one spiritual remedy, and that remedy is the Word of God. Let all the synods unite in establishing a permanent conference comprised wholly of theological professors and make it obligatory upon every theological professor to attend. So his view is the opposite of saying, let's not let the professors come and try to have their way. This body should meet at least once a year. The object should be the discussion of doctrine and practice. There should be an obligatory conference of the presidents of the synods. Here are the questions, not which synod is right or which synod is wrong. Each must believe that all is right. But the question is whether the synod that is right is doing its full duty toward the others. And then he says, I think the old minister was about right. What do you think? I would say that if you have a continuum in 1916 from, let's say, the most traditional beliefs to the most progressive, let's use those terms, today the continuum would be much wider in terms of maybe the traditional churches are quite a bit where they are, but the ELCA is a very large tent. And in order to organize it, it has taken in Lutherans from many small groups and a couple of the major groups, like what became the General Synod, what became the General Council. But they have never arrived at agreement on some things, and on other things, there is a lot of diversity. And I've even read a few analysts of the ELCA that says they run the danger of losing their Lutheran identity by becoming kind of swallowed in the general evangelicalness of the United States. And so he assumes in 1916 that we all pretty much agree. That assumption is less true now, I think, than it was then.
Yeah, it's a interesting conclusion, and I think other people, if they dug into it, would probably agree. Now, I already asked you if you had any unanswered questions, and would you like to do more research on this topic? It seems like you've got some other things on your mind. Do you have any other upcoming projects or areas of research?
Well, I've been working on a project which is out of my area because I really probably should stay in American Lutheran history. But in the course of my time in grad school, I was enlisted to write one of the Concordia commentaries that puts me in the Old Testament. And my professors in St. Louis were very obliging to me when I said, I don't even know the book that well in English. I don't teach at seminary and graduate school. I'm not a Hebrew teacher. This is going to take me a while. And they've given me a long time. And I'm working on the book of Judges. which is actually probably the right choice for me because Judges is almost postmodern in its way of looking at truth, and there's a lot of unusual things that have been written about it. I have the manuscript written, and as you know, the Concordia commentaries are those big blue ones that are really big and long. Interestingly, the project didn't start out to be that long, and I'm in the process now of editing and revising it for some uniformity, and some things I have to cut down, and some things I have to fix and improve. It's putsy work. And my editor just keeps passing me by saying, the field out there wants more of the books from the New Testament done first. So he's given me a lot of leeway. And I feel like when I get that done, which I'd like to have done all my work by next summer, then I have other areas of interest in Lutheran history, kind of Lutheran history on the ground, so to speak. One that I've just been thinking about recently is the president of the college where I went to college for priest seminary in Watertown was a prolific and pointed writer. He would write editorials for our church magazine, and he developed a quite severe rivalry with one of the secular opinion writers at a paper in Madison, Wisconsin, and they ended up kind of challenging each other a little bit. And yet the Madison writer came to admire him so much that he wrote his obituary about him when he died. Carlton Toppy was our person's name. This strikes me as a fascinating history. I think I'm fascinated when Lutheran writers or presenters present things that go outside of our little family, and they're being evaluated and challenged in larger areas. It's really hard to get a hold of information about this, but I'd like to work through people's letters and their, of course, their papers file to see just what was going on. In my dissertation too, I sometimes felt a little bit voyeuristic almost to be reading some of these letters.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you've got right in your hand, the piece of paper. And I could follow that Professor Brenner's grandfather, the Synod President Brenner, he apparently never got a new typewriter the whole time he was Synod President because one of the letters was a little bit off level all the way through all that important correspondence. There's a certain thrill that only a few people like us would have going through those papers. So,
yeah, I've always thought that that personal connection when you're seeing it with your own eyes or holding it, you kind of feel like you get the person a little bit more than reading about it on a neatly typed up secondary source. That primary research is really its own reward, I think.
Yeah, the secondary sources tend to homogenize things a little bit, and of course, I've read some really well-known authors in other fields who have said, I have to do this myself. You can have a assistant researcher or graduate student. You have to turn every page yourself because they aren't going to recognize something they're looking at there. They might just go right by. And for you, you see a certain comment and a light goes on because that's how that fits together. So I don't, unless I get some kind of mold disease from being with all those old papers in the archives. I like doing that. It's rewarding to me.
Yeah, I agree. Well, and finally, what would you like to see more research and writing done on within Lutheran history, just in general?
Well, I was at a meeting about a year ago of Lutheran historians and archivists from all the different synods. And I said to them, perhaps things are a little bit different with us than they are in other areas. We tend still to do a fair amount of historical research with the purpose of proving that we were right in situations where there is something controversial. And there's the old line about doing research the way a drunk leans on a lamppost. It's more for support than for illumination. I would like to see us do more of what the historians call disinterested history. Certainly we're not uninterested, but to go into something without clearly drawn expectations of what we're going to find. If you want to defend a church body's position from the past, you tend to overemphasize the parts that seem to agree and look the other way at parts that don't. And I'm excited for young historians, and you're one of them after hearing your paper, that you're trying to do this. And may your tribe increase of people that are trying to understand a certain situation, and they're just going to go where the research has followed them. when my book, A Tale of Two Synods, was being considered by our own Synods publishing house, there was an editor who said to me that he wasn't sure if he could publish the book. I'm outing him now, but he said to me, I don't know if we can publish it because I'm not sure you said clearly enough in the book that we were right. And I said, for all due respect, we've been telling people that for 40 years. Let's give them all the information and let them decide. But I said to him, if my history is wrong, I'll accept that. If you can say this, you've misunderstood this, and here's the proof. But I don't want to do history just to do it to support our view in a way which can be kind of artificial or cobbled together. And I think there is so much local and synodical history that's out there in these letters and papers and files. And now we've got, our church bodies has the space for archives and a wonderfully helpful archivist that will really look all over to find things for us. I've worked with her. She's one of our graduates, so I'm thrilled about that. And so this is something that more of us can do if you like the solitary time of spending time with these old papers and talking with other people who are also interested. That's exciting to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I do have on the calendar interview with Susan Willems, the
Good.
Wells archivist, and she'll kind of take a different approach and different angle on Lutheran history. So,
Yeah.
And I'll hopefully interview other archivists as well to help people know what's out there.
She is a treasure. And for us to have had our historical papers in people's attics and boxes and nearly thrown away sometimes, and where were they going to go? We couldn't have gotten anybody better as a person who has the skill and the eagerness and the personality to do such a wonderful job putting this together. We are very happy and proud of her.
Well, good. Well, thank you for your time today talking about Little Journeys with Luther. I do hope sometime in the future to discuss The Tale of Two Synods with you, your most popular work, I guess, or what you're most known for. Even though you're talking about the need for disinterested history, I think that was definitely a project that needed to be done, and I think we're all thankful that you presented that history and that we have it available.
Well, I hope people find that history accurate and perhaps even interesting. When people sometimes say, I really enjoyed your book, I say, really? Because in its own way, it's a sad story. Mm-hmm. And so there are some heartbreaking things, I think there. I'm excited that young Missouri Synod pastors are reading this and saying, there's so much about our history I didn't know till they read it there. And I tell them, well, it all comes from your sources. So get back into your sources because that's where you'll find it. So I'm glad it's making a contribution.
All right. And next episode, we'll hear from Pastor Nathaniel Biebert and his work on Johannes Streeter. Thank you for your time today, Dr. Braun.
Thank you.